can you think about the significance of this concept without regurgitating some pre-given answer that I give you in class? Although, as we do go through these concepts, I'm going to try to suggest some lines of thought that you might discuss in terms of significance. Right? So is everyone clear on this? And I really just want to emphasize something here. Don't dismiss this as unimportant, the short essay portion. I've just seen this again and again. Students seem not to take seriously the fact that we're looking for 2 solid paragraphs, or sometimes they'll just say, oh, the definition is enough, and they won't really talk about the significance, because of course that's the part that's hard. That's the part that requires you to do some independent thinking. They'll blow it off and they'll just crash and burn on this 4th exam. Students who've done well on the first 3 exams, they don't take the essay portion seriously, and their final average just really suffers because they crash and burn on 50% of the exam on the final. So do take it seriously, take good notes, and you should do well. All right, any questions about this? Okay, if not, let's continue on looking at John Locke and John Locke's social contract theory. I have in front of me an excerpt from a 9th grade civics textbook. It was popular in the 1980s, and perhaps it will remind you of your civics textbook when you were a 9th grader. In this particular chapter of the book, the question is posed, why is government necessary? And by way of an answer, the book tells the story of an imaginary town called Whizbang. And it reads like this. Following the discovery of oil, the town came into being almost overnight. The great majority of people were willing to obey the law, but because the town was so new, everybody was busy taking care of their own interests. But soon thereafter, criminals came to town. People were killed. When an oil driller and his family arrived, the children were sick with measles, and instead of keeping them at home, the parents permitted them to go wherever they pleased. Thus, they exposed others to their germs. Since there was no public health officer, other people in the community had no way of protesting about the spread of the disease. Conditions grew worse until a committee of citizens called a mass meeting in which the people elected officers. The people agreed to help the officers in keeping the law, keeping order. Criminals who did not leave the city of their own accord were arrested and thrown into jail. Persons with contagious diseases were quarantined. Rules were made for the disposal of sewage and garbage. Through community organization, government came to Whizbang. Now there's a trickle-down effect in the history of ideas. According to this theory, the obscure doctrines of one age are taken for granted in subsequent ages, or watered down. And that's exactly what seems to have happened here with this story in this textbook of Whizbang. This story is really a watered-down version of social contract theory, a theory that was developed in the 16th and 17th and 18th centuries. And the most famous version of social contract theory is John Locke's Second Treatise of Government. Now, let's just refresh our memory before we get into the details of social contract theory. Let's just review where we were. Locke is writing this social contract theory. He's developing it because he doesn't like the prevailing view of where legitimate government comes from. Or where does government authority come from? One of the prevailing views in his day is the divine right of kings. This is a doctrine which says that God anoints a king to rule and gives him absolute authority to rule. And Locke is refuting one of the more famous, persuasive attempts to defend divine right of kings. This is by Robert Filmer. He wrote this book called Patriarcha. And let's just review Filmer's argument quickly and then how Locke replies to it. Okay, Filmer tells us that kings have absolute power by natural right because human beings were born into subjection, in natural subjection to our fathers. And Filmer argues that kingship is a special case of fatherhood. And Filmer also argues that kings have absolute power by divine right. Okay, this would be an argument made from Scripture. God made Adam the father of the human race, Filmer tells us, and that every king inherits the fatherhood of his people as an heir of Adam. Okay. So these are the primary precepts of Filmer's argument here. Okay, Locke refutes this. Locke says kings do not have absolute power by natural right. We would only owe absolute obedience to a king that created us or who is infallible. Now, to be sure, children owe honor and obedience to parents, but it's not absolute, because parents did not create their children. They only begot them, and parents are also fallible. So if your parent orders you to do something to violate the natural law or to violate the divine law, children are not obligated to obey. And so Locke says only God has absolute authority over us because only God created us and only He is infallible. So that takes care of natural right of kingship. And Locke also refutes the idea that kings have power by divine right. He says kings do not have absolute power by divine right because, again, kings are fallible. They're limited by a higher law. Even the kings in the Old Testament were limited by a higher law. They had to write out the Old Testament in the Torah by hand before they took the throne to demonstrate that they understood the law and that they'd submit to it. But not only that, even if Adam's heirs did have absolute authority, the lines of inheritance could not be determined. How are we going to figure out what is the line of firstborn sons going back to Adam in 17th century England? We can't do this. So, first of all, he disagrees that Adam did have absolute authority and that any king would. And he also says even if they did, we couldn't determine the lines of inheritance going back to Adam. So, Locke has destroyed Filmer's theory of the divine right of kings, but, as I said, Locke is a responsible critic. He's not one of these people who gets up and tears down but doesn't replace. Destroying is easily. Okay? Any fool can get up in front of a class and criticize capitalism, for instance. I mean, that's the easiest game in the world. But a responsible critic would tell you what's a better system, and he'd make an argument for a better system. It's the easiest thing in the world for a professor to get up in front of a class and trash Western civilization and the Western cultural heritage, point out flaws in the Western cultural heritage. Anybody can do that. That's an easy game. But to be a responsible academic or a responsible critic, you have to discuss a better, a viable alternative to it. And that's what Locke's going to do. Filmer has given this theory of where legitimate government comes from. What is legitimate authority grounded in? He's destroyed that theory, and as a responsible person, he's going to establish a new theory of where legitimate government comes from, and that's going to be social contract theory. All right, so let's look at it. We can discuss Locke's social contract theory by establishing 10 logical steps. There are 10 logical steps that we can use to explain this theory. Now, first of all, let me say, what is Locke up to? Just to give you background of what he's doing here. What Locke wants to do, his mission in the second treatise of government is to, okay, I've destroyed one theory of legitimate government, I need to create another one. Now, what am I trying to do here? I'm trying to figure out what would be the legitimate grounds for establishing a government. What would be a legitimate basis for establishing a government and having a government of legitimate authority? So he thinks to himself, all right, to figure this out, it might help me to go back to a place or a time in human history when there was no government. Go back to a time in which there was no government. And then if I could rationally think about what might have been reasons that people would have established government in the first place. So he's trying to recreate ancient history and think about why people might have had legitimate reasons to establish a government in the first place. And he's going to call this state in which human beings existed without government, he's going to call it the state of nature. We'll see that in a minute. But anyway, he starts off, I guess we can start off explaining this by definition of government. Locke sees government as having authorized and impartial judges. That's what government essentially is for Locke. It's having officials who are authorized. That means they're recognized by the members of the community, and they impartially interpret the law and they enforce the law. This is essentially what government is all about for Locke. It's to have authorized impartial judges who enforce the law. However, in the beginning, he reasons, there was no government. In the beginning, there is no government. He calls this the state of nature. Now, what is he thinking of here? Could be a number of things. He may be thinking back to early human history, or earliest human history, when people lived in small families, hunter-gatherer clans, and there was no government. He may be thinking about that. He may also be thinking about a town like Whizbang, where a town just pops up in West Texas, where there is none, because oil is discovered. And people congregate there, wildcats to drill oil, and there's no government. Or, especially for Locke, what he may have in mind is at the time that he's writing, England is beginning to colonize North America. And you've got colonists who are landing there, like the Pilgrims. He wrote a constitution for one of these early colonies. People landed there, and there was no government, no established authority. So these are all things that he may be thinking of in terms of the state of nature. Now, what does he say about the state of nature? He says it's a state of perfect freedom. The state of nature is a state of perfect freedom. In the state of nature, you're free to order your actions, as he puts it. That is, that's to live as you like, within certain limits that we'll mention in a minute, to dispose of your property and your possessions as you see fit. So basically, to live as you like, to make a living as you see fit, to acquire property, to use your property as you want, to sustain yourself. So the state of nature, the SON, is a state of perfect freedom. He says the state of nature is a state of perfect equality. Not only are human beings free in the state of nature, but human beings are also equal in the state of nature. And we discussed the reason why this is in our last lecture. Locke says, all men are the workmanship of one omnipotent and infinitely wise maker. That God has made us all the same species, with the same basic faculties. Remember, he looks at nature and he says, are we like ants and bees that have worker and drones and queens, which are obviously have been given different faculties, and it's almost like you have subspecies, inferior and superior subspecies within a species. Are human beings like that? Locke says, no, we're not like that. We have differences, but they're not really fundamental. We're all of the same nature or essence.
Maybe,
we're ontologically equal. He says all men belong to God and were put here for his purposes, not those of other men. We are all the servants of one sovereign master. We're all sent into the world by his order and about his business. Last class we talked about all men were a property of God's church, and that were put here for his pleasure, not the pleasure of others. And that's important because from that it follows no man should be in subordination or subjection to another.
Wait, are you already back at school?
This is why we are equal.
After the summer class.
As we are ontologically equal. As human beings created by God. No man should lord power over another man.
No, I don't have
all equal in that sense.
I did one that works, but I don't have the games.
Now, the next logical step in explaining social contract theory, number 3, is that having no government does not mean that there is no law. Locke says the state of nature is a state in which there is no civil authority. There's no government. Wait a minute. If human law is what's constituted by him who has care of the community, as Thomas would say, but by the civil authorities, how can Locke say that it's not a lawless place?
I wish you had it on Steam.
How is it that there is a law in the state of nature if there is no government?
Yeah.
The natural law, exactly.
I wonder if everybody's selling the digital key on the interweb.
The natural law is this universal moral law that God has either written on our hearts, as Thomas would say, or Locke would say that it is something that we can perceive through sensory perception and understand through reason and empirical observation of reality. There are universal moral precepts that we can know by the ordinary exercise of reason. And Locke says, even though there is no government, we are bound to obey the natural law in the state of nature. We have to obey it because God instituted it, and we're all held morally accountable to God to observe it.
Ooh, COD Modern Warfare bundle.
Now, what kinds of laws are there in the natural law? Locke says there are primary rights and obligations under the natural law.
Damn.
He's going to list three. These would sort of be the equivalent of Thomas's primary precepts of the natural law. Locke lists three. I don't know that he intends this to be an exhaustive list, but these are three very important ones for him.
I've been playing zombies so much.
Locke says, I have an obligation to love and preserve myself.
Yeah, this is pretty much all we do.
Locke says, I have an obligation to love and preserve myself.
Just, it throws me back, dude.
Why? Again, because I'm not my own.
Cues and stuff.
I've been created in God's image. He's given me life.
Baby.
And since I did not give myself life, Locke says, you don't have the right to take it.
I need to see if I can download the other maps too.
You didn't give yourself life, so you do not have the right to take your life. So this is a natural law argument for self-preservation against suicide. But also this can be, you can see a natural law argument for this as well, or another natural law argument. All human beings have a natural inclination to preserve themselves. We all have an instinct for survival. So Locke says this is evidence of the natural law. Locke would also say you have an obligation to love others. This is essentially the same as Thomas saying that you should not do gratuitous harm to other people. You should not do gratuitous harm to others. You have an obligation, Locke says, to love others. If others are created in the image of God as well, bear his image, have their value and dignity because of that, and they're the property of God, put here for his purposes, you can't harm them. And finally, Locke says you have an obligation to preserve others as much as possible. You should not take another man's life. You should not take another man's liberty. And you should not take another man's property. These are three natural rights we'll talk about in a minute that stem from this. He says the right to life, liberty, and property, which Thomas Jefferson in the Declaration of Independence would change to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But this comes from Locke. Life, liberty, and property. He sees these as three fundamental natural rights that you have. So that brings us to number 4. Locke would argue that humans have natural rights that flow from the natural law. Human beings have natural rights that flow from the natural law. If it is a natural law precept that you should not murder, I have a natural right not to be murdered. That is, I have a natural right to life. If it is a natural law precept that you should not steal, I have a natural right to my property. You can't take it. Now, I want to point out something that's very, very important here. In Locke, we are beginning to get talk of rights. In Aristotle and Thomas, you don't really see rights talk. And this is very important. Remember, for Aristotle, and this is hard for us to see because it's just, as Americans, it's inconceivable to us. Aristotle, for all the good ideas that he had, and the Greeks, okay, if you were not a citizen, if you were not a member of the political community in the poli, the city-states that Aristotle was talking about, you didn't have rights. Rights were only granted to citizens. And you could see in an oligarchy or aristocracy that that could mean that the vast majority of people had no rights. No rights that the government was bound to recognize. None. Rights for the Greeks, for Aristotle, were something that were awarded to you as an honor for meeting the qualifications of citizenship, whatever they were. Whether you had a certain amount of money, whether you were born in the right place, whether you came from the right family. If you meet our criteria for citizenship, we, due to the benevolence of our hearts, we as the political community, we are going to bestow these rights on you. Be thankful for it. Okay? And if you're not a citizen, you don't get those rights. So for Aristotle, there's no such thing as pre-political rights. That is, people don't have rights before they are in a political community. And this is of huge significance because for Locke, Locke says you have pre-political rights. You have rights prior to your joining a political community or before becoming a citizen. You have rights. Okay, they're pre-political because they come from the law of nature, okay, the natural law, which predate government. They predate your joining a political community. They predate all government. The natural law existed before then. That natural law gives you certain natural rights that come before citizenship rights. And that is just of huge significance. We'll talk about why that's significant later. So, Locke says humans have these natural rights that flow from the natural law. We're really getting introduced to this idea of rights for the first time. The idea is there in Aristotle in the idea of natural justice, that there are certain things that are just whether we agree to call them so or not. He's got the seed of the idea there, but he doesn't develop it. For Thomas, he doesn't really talk much about rights either, although his whole concept of natural law, which is underpinning Locke's thought, is obviously very compatible with this notion of rights as well. But really, we have to wait for Locke to really have this developed. All right. Now, but there's a problem. Even though in the state of nature there is this law that we're bound to obey, the natural law, Locke says people don't always obey it in the state of nature. And this is not hard to understand why, because we know that people don't even obey the natural law where we do have civil authorities constituted. The neighbor across the street just told me the other day that he left his garage door open at night, and the light was on, and somebody walked in and took his weed eater. That's with police and jail cells and handcuffs and, courts of law. Imagine if in a state where you don't have government, obviously the natural law is not going to be obeyed perfectly. And Locke, again, coming from a Christian worldview, would argue that this is because man is in a fallen state. He's in bondage to sin. Our reason, our will, our emotions are defective, they're defaced, and so we don't observe the natural law perfectly. In fact, we rebel against it. We're hostile. We're at war with our nature, in a sense. Another premise of social contract theory, sixth one, is that in the state of nature, every individual is the enforcer of their own natural rights. So that's a question. In the state of nature, you have this natural law, which everybody is bound to observe. Who enforces it in the state of nature? Locke says everybody, or at least every adult. Every adult has the right to enforce their own natural rights in the state of nature. Or to give you the imagery, in the state of nature, it's like a Wild West town without a sheriff. There's no marshals who's arrived into Dodge City yet. And in the state of nature, in this Wild West town of whiz-bang, everybody carries their six-shooters. Okay, everybody's packing. And everybody has the right to enforce their own natural rights. I have a right to protect my life. I have a right to protect my property. My family, in this state of nature, everybody enforces their own natural rights. But you can imagine that this brings problems.
Has your day been so far, Sandy?
There are enforcement problems in the state of nature.
It's been good. Nowadays, mostly just been sitting listening to this lecture.
Perhaps up to now that, this sounds pretty good. State of nature, state of perfect freedom, state of perfect equality. There's this natural law that we're all bound to observe. I have the right to defend my natural rights. Sounds good. But it's not. Locke tells us, he says that there are inconveniences or problems enforcing the law, the natural law in the state of nature. One problem is the absence of human law. One benefit of the human law is it gets us all on the same page about what is right and wrong. We have a common written law that we can understand and know and obey. The natural law isn't written. The natural law is only something that we apprehend by reason. It's not written down anywhere. And because people are fallible in the reason, we may disagree about what the natural law says. Hey, why do you have your sheep grazing on my land? Well, you haven't been using that land. Well, I was planning on using that land. Well, my understanding of the natural law is if that land wasn't being used by you, it's fair game for me to take it. Yeah, but I was about to use that land. Well, too bad.
I have 2 copies of Black Ops 2.
So there's a misunderstanding. There's no real estate deed that we can turn to.
And you said
there's no survey of the property.
Wait, did you say you have Black Ops 2 or it's stuck
by
in
the civil authority?
So
an absence of human law is going to lead to conflict, disputes over what the natural law is and how and not only what the natural law says, but how to apply it to particular circumstances of human society, of human living.
Actually,
another problem in the state of nature is the lack of impartial judges.
Happened. One of them didn't work, and I went and bought a copy of it.
This is a problem. If we're all enforcing our own natural rights in the state of nature, that means you are the judge and the jury in cases involving you. Okay, you're your own judge and jury. And how likely are we to be impartial as we're residing over our own cases? Not very. Farmer Rollins comes to my house and says, "Boy, that pig is ugly. I love that pig." Boom. Okay, I have fond affection for this pig. You just insulted my pig. I'm going to shoot you. Okay? Or you insult my wife. Take a more realistic example. Okay, and I say, the penalty for insulting my wife should be, I'm going to kill you. Most courts would not say that's a just punishment for insulting a man's pig. So obviously that's a problem in the state of nature. Or, more realistically, suppose you steal my pig. And you steal my cow. And that ticks me off. I'm mad. That was my favorite cow. That's my best milker. You stole it. Okay? Boom. Justice in the state of nature. That's probably not a fair punishment for the crime. The punishment doesn't fit the crime. And this is a problem that you have when you don't have impartial judges, when judges are biased because they're members to the case. Another problem in the state of nature enforcing the natural law is ineffective enforcement. I'm Farmer Baraka, okay, I'm 5'7", 155, 60 pounds, okay, and, Farmer Jones steals my cow, and he's 6'4" and 240. Can I have my cow back, please? No. Justice, okay, in the state of nature. It's over, okay? In the state of nature, might makes right. The weak are at the mercy of the strong. And this is where posses come from. You get a posse together of your buddies to go against somebody stronger than you, but that may not work either. So it's very hard to enforce the natural. You've got all of these defects, or what Locke calls inconveniences of law enforcement, enforcing the natural law in the state of nature. So what's the solution to this problem? Locke says the solution, the remedy, is to establish impartial judges. That is, the community gets together and they say, we are going to establish, we're going to choose some of us in this room. Suppose we're in this classroom, we're in the state of nature right now. And the big guys like Dan and Daniel, they're just beating up on us, okay? They're stealing all our property. We can't do anything about it. We decide, hey, let's bond together. Let's establish a law enforcement system. Let's establish judges who will rule over us. We'll give them the authority to enforce the natural law, and this is basically the establishment of a government. This is the Georgia Supreme Court. It says, upon the integrity, wisdom, and independence of the judiciary depend the sacred rights of men and women. So they're talking about sacred rights. This is very Lockean, because Locke believes we have sacred rights as well. The natural rights are sacred rights, pre-political rights. All right. So that's the remedy, but there's still another problem. This agreement to establish impartial judges, it can't work unless everybody agrees to submit to the judges. Suppose Dan and Daniel, they say, I like living in the state of nature. I'm doing really well. I'm stealing everybody's property. I don't have to work for it. I'm living large. I like this. I got the easy life. And they say, I don't recognize your government. I'm going to continue to pack my guns, and I'm going to continue to enforce my own natural rights as I see them, and I don't respect your government at all. That's a problem. Okay? It's going to be difficult to establish justice in a community like that. And so Locke says, we all have to agree. There has to be a unanimous consent, and we'll talk more about why it has to be unanimous next time. We have to agree to submit to these governing authorities. In a sense, if you want the imagery, we have to go in, we have to lay down our guns and say, I am giving up my right to enforce my natural rights in the state of nature. I'm giving it up to you, the government authority, to enforce my natural rights for me. I hereby forfeit my right to enforce my own natural rights. You are now going to do it for me in the expectation that you'll do it more effectively than what I had under the state of nature. That agreement is called the social contract. That's what the social contract is. It's this mutual agreement to give up your right to enforce your natural rights and to give it to the government, to a civil authority. That's what the social contract is. And I'm going to give you a more concise definition of it in a minute. But that's basically what this is all about. The social contract is not a constitution. Okay? A constitution is a document that lays out the particular structures and functions of a government. 3 branches, this is what their powers are, this is how people are elected, this is what their term. That's not what a social contract is. The social contract is merely an agreement to set up a government and obey it. Now, a question we might ask is, where is Locke getting this idea? And did this ever happen? I mean, has there ever been a historical example of people, I mean, this sounds nice in theory as a way that legitimate government could come about, but did it ever happen historically? Is there an actual historical example of this happening? Well, there is. And it would have been one that happened just before Locke was born. The Mayflower Compact is an example of a social contract, very explicitly so. This was written in 1620 by the Pilgrims, who landed in Plymouth Bay. And before they got off the Mayflower, they sat down and they signed this agreement. And it is basically a social contract. And you'll see this, okay, that it's not a constitution, it's different. It says, in the name of God, amen. We whose names are underwritten, the loyal subjects of our dread sovereign Lord King James. Okay, James I, we talked about him. Having undertaken, for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith in honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia, do by and these presents solemnly and mutually in the presence of God and one another, covenant and combine, contract ourselves together into a civil body politic for our better ordering and preservation of furtherance of these ends aforesaid. And by virtue here, to enact, constitute, and frame such just and equal laws, ordinances, acts, and constitutions and offices, from time to time as shall be thought meet and convenient for the general good of the colony, and which we promise all due submission and obedience to. Okay, so this is not a constitution, it's just an agreement. They're saying we're going to set up a government, we're going to enact laws and ordinances, and we agree to submit to them. Okay, this is a social contract. Now, one thing I want you to note about this: when did Locke publish the Second Treatise of Government? He published the Second Treatise of Government in 1690. He probably wrote it in the 1680s when he was in exile in Holland. When was this social contract signed? 1620. Okay, what does that tell us? It tells us that John Locke did not invent social contract theory. Okay, he did not. This was an idea that had been swirling around, certainly in the Reformation period, this whole understanding of government as a contract between the governed and the rulers. So Locke didn't invent this idea. He basically is famous for writing one of the more influential explanations or discussions of it, which is the Second Treatise. So, how about a concise definition of SCT? This would be a good concise definition that you could use in the first paragraph of your short essay. Social contract theory is the idea that government originates as an explicit or implicit contract among individuals who will agree to obey the laws in exchange for protection of their natural rights. That's a good short definition of social contract theory. The idea that government originates as an explicit or implicit contract among individuals who agree to obey the laws in exchange for protection of their natural rights. This is going to be a lecture that's loaded with lots of text on the slides, so this is a real good one to download and print out if you're normally not doing that. This is a lecture I'd recommend that you do print out the outlines. So that's a definition of social contract theory. Now, I also want you on your short essays to have a second paragraph that discusses its significance. You could talk about the implications of social contract theory. Why is it important? If this theory of the legitimate foundations of government is true, what implications flow from it? One implication of social contract theory is that the primary purpose of civil government is to enforce the natural law and uphold natural rights. According to social contract theory, according to Locke, this is the primary purpose of government: to enforce the natural law, uphold natural rights. How does this differ from Aristotle's understanding of the primary purpose of government? Okay, this is a very different purpose of government, ultimate purpose of government, than what we saw in Aristotle. Aristotle basically said the highest purpose of government is to perfect its members in virtue, or at least work toward that end. For Locke, no. Locke sees government as having a much less exalted, much more limited function. It's not to perfect you in virtue. The purpose of government is to uphold the natural law, protect your natural rights. And that's not as much as what Aristotle is looking at. Does this mean that Locke doesn't care about people developing virtue? Absolutely not. Okay, Locke is concerned about that. And he'd probably agree with Thomas and Aristotle, or Thomas, that virtue is our temporal good. But Locke simply believes that development of the virtue is something that is better instilled through families, churches, non-governmental associations. And it's not the primary function of government. So that's something you could talk about. You know, that difference of opinion. Well, another implication of social contract theory that obviously follows from this is that governments are limited in their authority. Governments are limited in their authority. Specifically, they're limited because they cannot violate the natural law. They can't violate your natural rights. And again, that idea is just a big yawner for 21st century Americans because we take it for granted like, well, of course. How else could it be? We're sort of like fish in water. You know, we don't recognize that we're in water. We don't know what water is because we're swimming in it, okay, in these freedoms that we take for granted. But it's important for you to recognize if you do some traveling in other parts of the world, there are governments that don't really view their powers as limited. They don't recognize limits on their power. Totalitarian regimes, for instance, like North Korea. The government doesn't really recognize any limits on its power, at least vis-a-vis its subjects, its population. Another implication of social contract theory is that governments are founded on the consent of the governed. Or we should say legitimate governments. An implication of social contract theory, a very important one, is that legitimate government is founded on the consent of the governed. This government derives its legitimacy from the fact that I have consented to it. I've consented to it because they've agreed to protect my natural rights better than I could in the state of nature. That's why I invested you with power, Mr. Government. I see you as legitimate because I've consented to your government. And of course, this is what Thomas Jefferson's talking about in the Declaration of Independence. He says governments are founded to protect these God-given rights that he talks about, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then the next thing he says is whenever governments become destructive of these ends, that is, whenever the government fails to protect your natural rights, it is the right and the duty of the people to abolish it. You can get rid of the government. We'll talk more about that in a subsequent lecture, or you'll see that he has a whole chapter on the dissolution of government. When exactly can you do that? If you see the government just make one mistake in infringing on your natural rights, can you abolish it? Well, he talks about that in the last chapter of Second Treatise. And fourth, that the governed may replace illegitimate governments. Okay, this is another implication of social contract theory. That if the government, as Jefferson says, becomes destructive of these ends, that is, upholding the natural law, protecting your natural rights, you can chuck it. Okay, you can get rid of it. You can abolish it. Let's look at another key concept that's going to be on your short essay portion. Authority. Okay, authority. And this is a good time to point out that I did not decide on this list. Okay, this is a list developed by a committee of political science or government professors. And if I was making up the list, I would not have put authority on it, but it's there. Okay, to me, it's just too basic a concept. But anyway, authority. If you were going to define authority, you could say it's the right to command people or to act. Okay, this is a standard definition of authority from Webster's Dictionary. The right to command people or to act. Now, another important concept, this one is not one of your essay questions, but it's important for seeing, tying together a bunch of ideas, okay, is the concept of legitimacy. Legitimacy is the belief that people have that a regime or an authority is proper and therefore deserving of their obedience. It's the belief that people have that a regime is proper or an authority is proper authority and therefore it's deserving of their obedience. Does anybody see a connection between authority and legitimacy? How might these two concepts or conditions be related to each other? That's good. You can't have the first one without the second one. That is, I think that's a little overstated. I would weaken it a little bit and say you're going to have much less authority if you lack legitimacy, or your authority is going to be weaker the weaker your legitimacy is. I see this in my home on a daily basis. Okay, my oldest daughter Amelia is 7 now. This is the one who at 5 years old told me that she was ready to rule the world. And she has a 5-year-old brother who she likes to practice on. Okay, And she likes to tell him, Daniel, clean up your room, okay? Or, Daniel, don't do this, don't do that, okay? But he does not, in his little 5-year-old mind, he understands, okay, that she does not have legitimate authority over him. And so he responds, you're not my mom. You don't have legitimate authority over me. And so the point is, if you don't have legitimacy, that people don't recognize your authority as being proper and therefore deserving of obedience, you're going to have a tougher time exercising effective authority over a population. Why I wanted to sort of weaken what Jared said was because there are governments, of course, in the world today that lack legitimacy, but effectively their populations by and large do obey them. I would venture to guess that there are a good number of North Koreans, Cubans, people in Laos, people in Russia who see their governments as illegitimate, but they by and large obey their governments because out of fear. There are basically two ways you can get people to obey a government: consent or fear. And it's a lot easier for a government if people consent to your rule than if it's based solely on fear. So this is the main point we're making here, that in order to have effective exercise of authority, legitimacy helps. It's an easier way to get authority or exercise effective authority if the people see your government, as legitimate. Now, what are potential sources of legitimate authority? On what basis could a government claim to have legitimate authority and have the people recognize it as legitimate? One famous German sociologist, Max Weber, hypothesized that there are 3 legitimate sources of authority, or 3 types of legitimate authority. He said one type of legitimate authority is what he calls traditional authority. And this is where people accept a form of rule, a form of government, simply because it has been in existence for so long. So, for instance, if you asked somebody in a tribal village in Benin, Africa, why do you obey the village elders when they tell you to do this and that? Because we've always obeyed the village elders. That's the way it's always been. And that can be an effective source of authority because it's tradition. Or in England, why do you still put up with the Queen and the royal family and their shenanigans? Because we've always had the Queen. The Queen is traditional. Or the Emperor Akihito. The emperorship goes back, it's, I don't know, hundreds of years old, if not, millennia. The idea of having an emperor in Japan. These are traditional sources of authority, and people obey it because they're just comfortable and familiar with it. But let me point out, an important thing I want you to see here, though, is that in modern times, in contemporary times, fewer and fewer people are accepting this as a grounds for authority. Fewer and fewer people are willing to accept the argument that we recognize your authority because it's always been. For instance, the Liberal Party in England, they would like to get rid of the monarchy. They think it's a waste of money. And again, you can see this in England because back in the early 19th century, the Queen of England actually had, or the monarch of England had a lot of power. But over the course of the 19th century and into the 20th century, the powers of the Queen have been taken away from her, given to Parliament and the Prime Minister, to the point today that the Queen is essentially a figurehead. She's a ceremonial figure. She has no real political power. And that's because people are less willing to accept traditional authority sources. What's another source of authority, legitimate authority, according to Weber? What he calls rational legal authority. Rational legal authority. This is authority that's based on the rationality and legality of rules. And then the right of those who occupy positions by virtue of those rules to issue commands. And an example of rational legal authority, and this is important, and this is how you can tie together some concepts, an example of this would be social contract theory. It says, social contract theory has this story. It basically says, in the state of nature, there was no government. You had natural rights in this state of nature, but you couldn't enforce your natural rights very well. So government was established to more effectively uphold your natural rights. That's a plausible, rational story that actually a lot of Americans accept that idea. This is the dominant understanding of legitimate government in the United States. So we see it as rational. It makes sense to us. It's not an answer like, because we've always obeyed the government. Right? It provides a rational argument for why our government is legitimate. It's there to protect your natural rights, which you couldn't defend as well in the state of nature before there was government. And we agreed to set up this government, and we decided, since we need to hold this government accountable, we're going to have regular elections. We're going to have regular and fair elections, and people will come to power via these free and fair elections, and these people will promise, and they'll swear oaths to uphold our natural rights. And so the people who occupy positions of power via these rules that we establish, that we see as legitimate and legal, they're written into the election laws. We see George Bush as having authority because he won an election. We see members of Congress as having legitimate authority because they won elections by rules that we saw as rational. Mitch McConnell doesn't serve as senator, and I don't accept his authority because he's always been senator, or he's got some sort of traditional source of authority. I accept his authority because he was duly elected by legal procedures that I recognize as free and fair. And a point I should make here before we move off of this one is, in modern times, most people are really only willing to accept this source of authority. And social contract theory is an example of this. A third source of legitimate authority that Weber described was what he called charismatic authority. This is authority that one would have based on their individual magnetic or inspiring qualities, and leading followers to accept the form of government revealed or ordained by the person. Okay. This is a person who gains a following due to his magnetic qualities. It might be Moses, who spoke with God on the mountain, and he came down glowing with the radiance of God's glory. That'll give you charismatic authority pretty quickly, okay? Or Muhammad claimed to have spoken with God and had this, the Quran was dictated to him. Or Napoleon, he was a charismatic figure. Or a very negative example, Hitler. He, had a spellbinding, charismatic quality to him that made people want to follow him. So charismatic authority can be a source of legitimate authority, but again, it's like traditional authority. Fewer and fewer people in modern times are willing to accept charismatic authority. It's very hard to establish a government, a stable government based on charismatic authority. There are some political systems that try to do this. North Korea has deified Kim Il-sung, the original leader of North Korea, and Kim Jong-il, the current, the little guy with the funny hair. Kim Jong-il, the head of North Korea today. They've created this elaborate mythology, I don't know whether you know this, about him. Historians know that he was born in this part of Russia, just in the middle of forest, when his father was fighting. I think it was in the 1940s against the Japanese. So he was born in some cabin in eastern Russia in the middle of nowhere. But there's this whole mythology that he was born on a mountain. And this is official teaching in North Korea. Kim Jong-il, he wasn't born in a cabin. He was born on a mountain, a sacred mountain. And the stars were aligned just right, okay? And he's a deity. He's a semi-deity, and the recent leader of I think it's Turkmenistan. He's another guy who's tried to create a personality cult. That's what this is called in politics. You create a personality cult. You sort of imbue the political leader with almost the qualities of deity. And the Romans did this, starting I think with Julius Caesar. The Caesars started to take on or claim to have the attributes of gods, and that they should be worshipped. So we do see this even in some countries still today. But again, in modern times, fewer and fewer people are willing to follow figures like this, at least at the nation-state level. The place where you typically see it most is in cults, in religious cults, like Jim Jones and Heaven's Gate, the Branch Davidians, somebody who claims to have a divine connection or to be a prophet of God and to gain followers that way. So the basic point that I want you to see here is that historically there have been three legitimate sources of authority: traditional, rational, legal, and charismatic. But traditional and charismatic, less people are willing to buy that in modern times, which leaves rational, legal authority. Now, let's talk about the connection of social contract theory for authority. Well, here's the way I would do it. Since the definition of authority is very short, in your first paragraph where you're defining authority, maybe then you could talk about the three sources of authority. And so that would make a nice, well-rounded paragraph. And then in your second paragraph, where you talk about the significance of authority, these would be good themes to talk about. 1, effective government requires authority. That's pretty obvious. You're not going to have effective government without authority. For instance, there are people in Iraq, there are segments of the Iraqi population that don't recognize the authority of the Iraqi government. And that creates problems for the Iraqi government. So in order to have effective government, you have to have authority. Effective authority requires that the government is viewed as legitimate. Effective authority requires that the governed view the form of government as legitimate. Again, this is a problem in contemporary Iraq. Now, here's where authority ties in with social contract theory. Social contract theory, or SCT, facilitates effective government by providing a basis for the legitimate exercise of government authority. It provides legitimate grounds for rule. Okay, the government says, we rule by your consent. You've created us to enforce your natural rights, to uphold the natural law. That's what our purposes are. If we don't do a good job of that, you can get rid of us. Most Americans think that's an acceptable grounds for government. And the point I was emphasizing earlier, claims by governments to rule on the basis of grounds other than consent of the governed, other than rational legal authority, are less compelling in modern times. Therefore, these kinds of regimes are going to be less stable. Okay. So governments need to have a story, okay, a rational story that makes sense to people about why they should rule. If they don't, they're probably not going to be very stable governments. And in modern times, one of the more compelling answers to this question of where does legitimate government authority come from is social contract theory. Okay? It's the dominant one in the United States, I would say. Okay? Although I don't know how much it's taught anymore in grade schools. But now, so far we have two concepts that are going to be on your short essay: social contract theory and authority. Here's a third one: civil liberties. Okay, civil liberties will be the third concept on your short essay portion. What are civil liberties? They are freedoms that individuals have that government cannot violate. Okay, that's what civil liberties are. So there's a nice concise definition for civil liberties. And then, since that's not going to make a paragraph, you might give some examples of civil liberties. Things like freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, the right to bear arms, freedom from unreasonable search and seizure, the right to a jury trial, these sorts of things. Anything